Welcome, friends, to another We're Not Done Yet conversation. Today with Gary Stokes, who served in our United Church of Canada in congregational ministry for over 50 years. Now, Gary, you and I are among the many people who grew up in the late 20th century and in the church, and many of us were taught what to believe in and through creeds, ancient creeds like the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and then the more contemporary United Church Creed. We're not alone, we live in God's world. This is how we were taught what to believe. We often memorized these creeds, we said them in Sunday worship. You certainly know these very well. When did you begin to question whether these creeds were enough in terms of expressing what we're called to believe?
Well, that actually happened a bit later in my ministry. When I decided at age 18 that I wanted to pursue studies for the ministry, my interest was in being part of a serving profession, okay? Working with people in their life's journey to do what I could to help. I had no interest whatsoever in theology, please. Since I had grown up in the church, I attended Sunday school, I taught Sunday school, I sang in the church choir. The church seemed to be a logical place to begin this. It was during my undergraduate and graduate studies, both at the University of Toronto at Queen's and in Israel at the Hebrew University and the Swedish Theological Institute. Those studies involved the history, culture, and religious beliefs and practices of the great powers of the ancient Near East, Babylonia, Assyria, Egypt, and so forth, including Israel itself. Part of my studies involved the reading and the translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were just coming into in view to most people like myself. And that's when I first became aware that even Judaism was not the monolithic faith group that I had been taught it was. There were many different factions of that religion. Later in my ministry, around the 70s or the 80s, with the appearance of the Gnostic Gospels, these are Greek and Coptic religious documents that were found in the Egyptian desert in 1945. It became apparent to me that the same that was true of Judaism was also true of early Christianity, that the proto-Orthodox faith, pre-Nicaea, of the Gospels and the early church fathers was not the only form of belief and practice that existed in the early church of the first 4 centuries. That got me into looking into a comparison of the Orthodox faith and the belief system of the so-called Gnostics. I say so-called because it comprises a number of different and often contradictory views. I became aware of the variety of religious experiences and beliefs and practices of people who identified themselves as Christians. And subsequently, my discovery that I could not completely adhere to the various doctrines and creeds of Orthodox teaching, which I believe incidentally have continued to this very day, even in the non-Roman Catholic churches and those churches that arose during the Reformation. That's when I began in earnest to consider what exactly did I believe in.
So clearly it was your studies, the work you were doing, life was unfolding for you. All of this contributed to your own questioning. Looking back, do you have a sense of the Spirit being part of what was moving you?
I always believed that there was something within me directed by God that prompted me to ask questions, to approach things with an open mind. I became aware of that Spirit very early.
Yeah. And over time, you then began the task of creating your own credo, your own expression of faith.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about what was involved in that process for you? What was it like to do this very personal faith work?
Well, again, that happened later in ministry, particularly in the last maybe 10 years, um, when I sensed that some of the things that my own church was asking me to believe in, I could not accept fully. I had always, not in an offensive or attacking way, challenged my congregation to open themselves to alternate views, alternate understandings, beliefs. And I felt, well, if I was going to ask them to do that, then I better make sure that I know why I believe what I do. So I started this credo, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that has done it or is doing it, which more or less gives the reasons why I believe that way. And I used many resources that were available to me. Certainly the scriptures, as contradictory and as inconsistent as they may be, they are the faith stories of people down through the ages, and we really should be listening to them. I also depended upon the writings of the classical and what I would call liberal theologians of today. Uh, Facts of history. I'm basically an historian at heart. The inquiring mind and whatever degree of common sense or intelligence that God chose to give me, uh, and above all, the Spirit itself. Um, yeah, that's where I'm using. That's what I'm using to create this.
And it sounds to me as if it's a living document. It's not done yet.
It's a work
But
in progress.
it's a work in progress. We don't have time to go through every aspect of your credo, but I would be so delighted if you'd be willing to share some elements of it. And I would love to begin by asking, where is your thinking about God? Who is God for you at this point in your journey?
Well, that's my principal belief, is my understanding of God. Not that I know of the nature of God, and I don't know whether it's necessary to know of the nature of God other than what He has imparted. God is imparted through the Spirit. Because God is, as the theologians have described God, indefinable, ineffable. But I believe that God is the creator of all things. To use Tillich's definition, He is the ground of being itself. All big things begin with that first step, and thank God, God took that step. Okay, I don't know how it was taken exactly. That's the work of the scientist, I guess. Nor do I believe that the creation was an accident, that it was created on a whim, but that God created for a purpose. And in my humble belief, that purpose was the realization and the perfection of the type of world, the kingdom, you might say, or I prefer to use community of God, that God envisaged at creation. I believe that in God's wisdom, God created all things, not only humanity, but all of the aspects of nature. And He created us to participate in the achievement of that purpose. But to participate in the achievement, yes. To encourage us to become participants, I believe that God has endowed each of us with a portion of God's divine being, namely the Spirit. And to the extent that we are able to open ourselves to the urgings of that Spirit, to hear what it's saying, to realize the resources it offers. Paul in Galatians talks about some of the fruits of the Spirit. We'll become active and contributing participants in that purpose. I believe Jesus recognized the Spirit within him, and in a full commitment that most of us are unable to muster to that extent, Jesus opened himself to that Spirit completely, all defenses down. And he responded to those teachings through an act of life, of preaching, of teaching. I'm not sure about healing, but certainly of actions, and eventually through his death.
So given that understanding of who Jesus was, what's your thinking about our relationship with Jesus, with God, with Spirit?
Okay. Um, I'm here delving into something that I'm not necessarily so confident in, is the Christology and the nature of Jesus. I'll be brave and say I believe he was completely completely human. But the fact that Jesus was able to open himself to the Spirit so completely, I can see why the name divine was given to him. But that divinity is within each of us.
Within each of us.
Yeah.
Now, you've already spoken about how important the study of Scripture has been for you personally in your own ministry and your own life journey. As you put together your credo, I'm wondering where the Scriptures fit. And I know that over the course of our lifetime in the late 20th, now into the 21st century, there has been a lot of debate about the authority of Scripture, the role of Scripture, the significance of Scripture. Where do you find yourself today in that ongoing discussion?
Okay. The Orthodox Church came out and said, Scripture is the final authority. And we define that Scripture, we interpret it, so you have to follow what we teach about it. Those Scriptures, as different as they may be, were written by people who I believe were inspired by that Spirit within them to speak out about how they understood Jesus, how they understood God, how they understood creation, the world, and so forth, and our place in it. I still look to Scripture as being a valuable resource for the formation of my faith, despite its inconsistencies. However, I do recognize, and I think this is what prompted my search, you might say, is the fact that many people had different understandings. And the diversity of Christianity presents those differences. And simply because of the organization and the organizational work of Paul and the church fathers, orthodoxy won out. Okay, so other scriptures were either burned, negated, or sometimes the authors put to death. And but Scripture to me gives me an incentive to look more closely into those scriptures. I have been a student of Scripture for many, many years, and I guess I can honestly say, yes, I do preach from the Bible. But I studied this at the Swedish Theological Institute in Israel. I taught on it at St. Lawrence College in Cornwall for a number of years on subjects of Christian and Jewish origins and their beliefs. So yeah, Scripture has been a valuable resource to me. And if I were to encourage anyone wanting to do a credo, I would say, do not reject those scriptures. Do not ignore them, because they have valuable information. If not just the valuable information, they have the inspiration and the example of what one can produce when one opens himself or herself to the voice of God within you.
You are offering there wise counsel to others who may be thinking about creating their own credo. I wonder if there's anything else you would want to say to someone who might be considering this. It certainly sounds from what you've said so far that this has been a very valuable exercise for you. What would you say to others who may be listening to you and going, oh, I might just give what Gary's doing a try myself?
I should preface what I'm going to say by saying that in my preaching, I was never one to push my point of view forward as being the answer. I push it, I offer it as an alternative to allow people to challenge their faith on how others believed in God and Jesus and so forth. It may end up that they're affirming their own faith and saying, hey, I was right after all. Or it may end up by us saying, wait a minute now, why did I believe that way? This way sounds sensible too. Yeah, so I would encourage them to be open, to be honest. An open mind is wonderful. I encourage them to be reading Scripture, yes. To be listening to what the church fathers and the church leaders have said through the ages. I would encourage them to engage in conversation, not a defensive or offensive conversation with others, as has been done over the past years, but in an open, honest discussion, respecting each other's point of view, and agree to disagree if necessary, or agree to say, that's interesting, I'll give some thought to that. And be prepared, be honest, be prepared that while it may affirm your beliefs, at the same time, it may question your beliefs. Even a person with the most open mind, it may question your beliefs and lead you to say, I don't necessarily believe that anymore. I can recall an incident. I was teaching in Cornwall, and one lady who happened to be Roman Catholic, we were talking about the divinity of Jesus, and she asked me if I thought Jesus was divine. And I said to her, I think there's divinity in each of us. Well, she was devastated that I had destroyed her faith. And I apologized, of course, that I offended her, but I said, my intention was not to challenge, or not to destroy your faith, but to challenge your faith. And it's my contention, and I think the contention of many, that a faith that is it cannot be challenged is pretty weak. Is pretty weak, to say the least. So be open, be honest. Heaven has much more to say. Heaven has much more to say. It's not empty of revelation.
Gary, thank you so much for sharing with us today that you are not done yet, wrestling with your faith, challenging what has been taught through the generations. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It has been interesting, and I hope stimulating for some.